You're wasting your breath. I know. Then why are you still talking? Because somebody has to. Nettie Vale had not planned to get married on a Tuesday. She had not planned to get married at all. Not like this. Not to a man she had spoken 14 words to in her life. Not in the back room of a feed store that smelled of linseed oil and mouse droppings. But plans were a luxury. She had run out of the same afternoon the bank posted a notice on her father's door, and Nettie had learned fast that luxury was the first thing grief stripped away. Her father, Gene Vale, had died in his sleep 11 days ago. He was 51 years old. He looked 70 when they laid him out. The lung sickness had worked through him slow and thorough, the way rust eats iron, invisible and patient, until one day the whole thing just gives. He left her a mule named Biscuit, 3 hens, a cracked leather Bible with the back pages water-stained, and $460 of debt to the Cattleman Savings Trust of Arroyo Falls, Texas. Nettie was 23. The house went first. The bank didn't waste sentiment on it. Then the mule. Then, when she was sitting on the front step of her father's empty house, with no house left to sit in front of, Holt Granger walked up the dirt road and told her he was looking for a wife. She knew who he was. Everyone in Arroyo Falls did, the way you know a landmark without ever having visited it. Holt Granger was the man who appeared twice a year to trade at the dry goods store. He was the man who drove a wagon that looked like it had been assembled from the wreckage of several other wagons. He was the man with hands so calloused they looked carved, who never looked at anyone long enough to be considered polite, who bought 20-pound sacks of cornmeal and 50 yards of unbleached muslin and nothing soft. No tobacco candy, no penny licorice, no ribbon. Nothing that suggested there was comfort in his life or that he wanted any. She had heard he owned land somewhere south. How much, nobody seemed to know. A hill spread was the general theory. Enough to run some cattle, enough to keep himself fed and alone, which appeared to be all he required. He was 38. He did not ask her to dinner first. He did not bring flowers, or attempt flattery, or clear his throat and say something charming. He stood at the bottom of her father's empty step, turned the brim of his hat in his hands twice, and said, "I need a woman who isn't afraid of hard work and isn't expecting soft living. I've got land and a roof, and enough food to last through next winter. I don't have much else to offer. But I'm told you're in a situation." Nettie looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them flinched. "I'm in a situation," she agreed. The feed store preacher made it legal in 4 minutes. Holt's wagon had a board seat with a split down the middle that caught the seam of Nettie's only good skirt every time they hit a rut, which was constant. The road south of Arroyo Falls was not so much a road as a collective suggestion made by people who had passed this way before and given up trying to avoid the worst of the limestone outcroppings. The wheels found each one personally. Holt didn't talk. He held the reins of 2 raw-boned sorrels who moved with the resigned efficiency of animals who had made this trip many times and expected nothing pleasant from it. The sky was the color of old pewter. The mesquite thickets on either side of the trail grew low and mean, their branches full of thorns and dust. Nettie gripped the side of the wagon with one hand and held her small carpet bag in her lap with the other. It contained everything she owned: 2 dresses, a spare pair of stockings, her father's Bible, a bone comb, and a tin photograph of her mother taken the year before her mother died. She had been to the church social. She had danced with a boy named Francis from the grain mill who had soft hands and a nice smile, and she had thought, when she was 17 and the world was still arranged in the shape of possibility, that someday she would marry someone like Francis. Someone who smelled like soap and looked at her like she was a pleasant surprise. Holt Granger smelled like horse and iron filings. "How much land?" she asked. Because silence was only comfortable when you weren't hurtling toward an unknown life on a splintered board. "Enough." "What does that mean?" "It means enough." He shifted the reins to one hand, not looking at her. "More than you'd expect. That's not an answer. It's the answer I've got right now." Nettie pressed her lips together. She looked at his profile. He had a jaw like a fence post, square, weathered, set at an angle that discouraged argument. She looked away. The trail began to slope upward. The mesquite gave way to cedar, then to live oak, the trees thickening and darkening as the land rose. The sky went orange at the edges, then gray, then the deep bruised purple of a Texas dusk. She hadn't eaten since morning. She didn't ask. "We'll stop at the creek," Holt said, which was not an answer to anything she'd asked, but was apparently the only information he planned to volunteer. They stopped at the creek. It was a thin line of brown water moving slowly over flat rock. Holt unhitched the horses, letting them drink, and built a fire from dry cedar in what appeared to be a practiced and total absence of effort. He pulled a canvas bag from beneath the wagon seat and produced a piece of smoked venison, a small iron pan, and a pouch of cornmeal. He made johnnycakes without measuring anything, cooking them in the dry pan until they were black on the bottom and pale on top. He handed her 3 of them on a piece of cloth. "I'd have brought better if I'd known the trip would go long," he said, which was as close to an apology as she suspected he came. She ate all 3 without speaking. They were terrible. She didn't say so. When she looked up, he was watching her the way you watch a fire, not with intent but with attention, like he was taking stock of something without wanting to be caught doing it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect? More complaints?" "The night's not over," she said. Of something shifted in his face. It was brief, almost nothing, but it was there. The second day was worse. The trail climbed into the hill country proper, the cedar and oak closing overhead, the limestone outcroppings growing into genuine cliffs on either side of a narrow cut in the rock. The wagon was barely wide enough to fit the passage. The sorrels pinned their ears and moved through with obvious displeasure. Nettie's back ached. Her hands were stiff from gripping. The thin wool of her good dress, the one she'd worn to get married in without knowing she was going to get married in it, was no match for the October wind that found the gaps in her coat and lived there. She didn't ask him to stop. She told herself it was pride. It may have been. It may also have been something simpler, the recognition that asking this man to modify his pace for her comfort would change nothing except reveal that she needed her comfort modified. They crested a long rise near noon, and the land opened below them, a shallow valley cupped between 2 ridges of cedar-dark hill, a creek threading through the middle of it, cattle visible as dark shapes against the yellow grass. "That's the southern range," Holt said. "How much of it is yours? All of it?" Netta looked at the valley. She looked at the cattle. She estimated 30 head from where she sat, which meant there were probably more she couldn't see. "I thought you said a hill spread," she said. "I didn't say that. Other people say that." She turned to look at him. "How much land, Holt?" He was quiet for a moment. The sorrels blew and stamped. 4 sections, he said finally. 4 sections was 2,500 acres. 4 sections was not a hill spread. 4 sections was the kind of land that had a name. "You didn't think that was relevant to mention," she said. He didn't answer. He clicked the horses forward. They reached the house near dusk, or what Nettie assumed was the house. It was a low structure of chinked limestone set into the hillside, its roof nearly level with the ground behind it, a single chimney of rough-cut rock rising from one end. Firewood was stacked along the full length of the front wall, 10-12 cords of it, stacked tight and straight as a wall itself. She climbed down before he could help her and stood in the thin grass looking at the structure. "This is it," she said. "For tonight," he said, unhitching the horses. She turned around. "What does that mean?" He led the horses toward a solid limestone stable that was, she now noticed, considerably larger than the house. "Sleep," he said over his shoulder. "We'll talk in the morning." The inside of the Stones' house was 1 room, a rope bed against the far wall with a corn husk mattress and a quilt, a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove cold, a single oil lamp hanging from a peg in the ceiling. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. Nettie stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. She was a married woman. She had married a man who owned 4 sections of land and lived like someone who had never given himself permission to want anything. The bed was a single. Holt came in behind her. He saw her looking at the bed. He took a bedroll from a peg beside the door, crossed the room, and dropped it in the corner beside the stove without comment. She slept in the bed. She didn't sleep well. Through the single window she could see stars so dense and low they looked like something poured out carelessly. She thought about her father. She thought about the feed store and the preacher's 4-minute ceremony. She thought about the fact that she was now a married woman in a one-room limestone house in the hill country of Texas with a man she didn't know, and that this was the sum total of the choices that had been available to her. She didn't cry. She was very careful not to cry. In the morning he was already gone. The stove was lit, and a pot of coffee sat on the back of it. A plate of salt pork and fried egg yolks, the whites overcooked to rubber, waited on the table. She ate every bite. She spent the first day learning the place. The stone house was a bunkhouse, she realized, the original structure, the first thing built. There was a spring box built into the hillside 30 yards behind it, cold water channeled through hollowed cedar. The stable held 6 horses and the 2 sorrels. The tack room was organized to a precision that surprised her, every piece of leather clean and hung, the bits sorted by size. There was a smokehouse with 2 whole haunches of venison hanging, a root cellar with potatoes, dried beans, a rack of dried herbs she didn't expect, sage and rosemary, and something that might have been thyme. He had done all of this alone. She was turning that thought over in her mind when she heard him come in at dusk, the back door of the stable closing with its particular sound. She was in the kitchen by then, having found flour and lard and made biscuits, the only thing she trusted herself to make reliably. He came in, washed at the basin, sat down. He looked at the biscuits, he looked at the plate. He sat very still for a moment. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat, he ate. He ate 4 biscuits before he said anything else. "You found the root cellar," he said, "and the smokehouse and the herb rack." Pause. "The herbs were here when I bought the place." Whoever built the smokehouse grew herbs. "Do you use them?" "I know they exist." That was, she thought, probably the longest voluntary conversation she had gotten out of him. The second week began to shape itself differently. She took over the kitchen, not because he asked her to, but because cooking gave the day's structure. And structure was what kept her from thinking too hard about everything she had lost. She scrubbed the bunkhouse floor, swept the packed earth until it was smooth, and even found a bucket of whitewash behind the stable and applied it to the interior walls, which made the single oil lamp throw twice as much light. Holt came home each evening to something different: venison stew, bean soup with salt pork, puffs. Once, when she found a jar of dried apple slices in the back of the root cellar, apple dumplings in a cast-iron Dutch oven that took 3 hours and came out better than anything she'd made since her mother taught her. He ate everything she put in front of him in the particular silent way of a man who had been eating functional food for so long that he had forgotten meals could be anything else. On the 8th day, he brought in a piece of venison backstrap from the smokehouse, wrapped it in clean cloth, and set it on the table without comment. "For tomorrow," he said. It was an offering. She knew it and he knew it, and neither of them said so. She cooked it the next night, with rosemary from the rack and a piece of dried onion from the root cellar. He ate it slowly, with the careful attention of a man trying to identify what was different and not wanting to admit that he noticed. "That herb," he said finally. "Rosemary." "From the rack." "Yes." He was quiet. "It's better," he said, "than how I normally do it." That, from Holt Granger, Nettie was beginning to understand, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The night the season finally turned hard, she found out where the road behind the stable led. She hadn't meant to follow it. She had gone out to the spring box for water after dark, and the moon was full and low, and the trail was visible in a way it wasn't in daylight, silver and clear through the cedar. She followed it out of the simple human instinct that a lit path is an invitation. It curved up through the cedars for a quarter mile, climbing the back slope of the ridge, and then the trees opened. She stopped walking. Below her, in the natural hollow on the far side of the ridge, was a house. Not a bunkhouse, not a limestone shelter, a house. 2 stories of cut limestone, its corners squared with a mason's precision. A wide, covered porch, running the full length of the front, tall windows with glass panes that caught the moonlight. A cedar water tower stood to the east of it, a windmill turning slow in the night breeze beside it. 2 outbuildings she couldn't identify. A kitchen garden, winter bare but clearly tended, its rows straight and dark against the frost. There were no lights inside. The house was empty, but it was not abandoned. The porch boards were swept, the windows were whole. She stood at the edge of the tree line and stared at it for a long time. Then she turned around. walked back down the trail, refilled the water bucket at the spring box, and went back inside. She did not say anything to him that night. She was not entirely sure what she felt. The anger would come, she knew that. But first she had to understand the shape of what she was angry about. She confronted him the next morning. He was at the stove when she came downstairs, which was unusual. He held a cup of coffee, and he was looking at nothing with the particular focused quality of a man who had been awake for a while, thinking about something he didn't want to think about. "There's a house on the other side of the ridge," she said. He set the coffee cup down. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a particular door to open. "Yes," he said. "It's yours." "Yes." She looked at him. She had rehearsed something in her head during the walk down, something measured and precise, a series of logical points arranged like a court argument. What came out instead was simpler and worse. "You brought me here in that wagon. You made me sleep on a corn husk mattress. You fed me overcooked eggs." "The eggs were bad," he agreed quietly. "Holt." Her voice broke on his name, not with grief but with a fury she hadn't known she was carrying. "You have a house. You have a real house with glass windows and a porch and a windmill. Why are we in the bunkhouse?" He was quiet for a long time. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The morning light came through the small window and caught the gray in his hair and the deep lines around his eyes, all the years of weather that had settled into his face. "Because," he said, "the last woman I brought to that house didn't stay." The words landed flat and bare in the cold room. "She left in May," he continued. "Took the good horse and a flour sack full of silver coin I kept in the study. Left a note. Said she had endured sufficient hardship for the compensation offered." His jaw worked. "She was referring to me." Nettie looked at him. "I had brought her in a hired carriage," he said. "Fed her well from the start. Showed her the house first thing, like it was something to be proud of. She took all of it as something owed." A pause. "I don't blame her. I gave her nothing to fight through, no reason to build any attachment to the place. It was just a house full of someone else's things." "So you tested me," Nettie said. "I wanted to see what you were made of before I showed you what I was made of." The words were so unadorned and so exactly what they were that she didn't know, for a moment, whether she wanted to weep or throw the coffee pot at him. She stood very still. "You don't have the right to do that to a person," she said finally. "I was hungry, Holt. I was cold. I was sleeping on a mattress that smelled like it had been in a flood." "I know. That's not a defense." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He reached into the pocket of his coat. He set something on the table between them. It was a key, plain iron, large, the kind that fit a serious lock. "That's the front door," he said. "The other one on the ring is the study, where I keep the strong box." He pushed it toward her. "I'm not keeping you here. I'm not keeping you from anything. If you want to go back to Arroyo Falls, I'll drive you myself, and I won't ask for what I spent on the debt repayment." She looked at the key. She looked at his hands on the table, the scarred knuckles, the cracked skin of a man who had worked alone for a very long time. "You paid my father's debt," she said. "The bank was going to sell the parcel. I bought the note. Before you came to find me, yes." She pressed her teeth together so hard her jaw ached. "You bought my father's debt and then came to offer me a trade. I came to offer you an option." His voice was steady but not defensive. "You didn't have many. That doesn't make it clean." "No," he said again. "It doesn't." The silence between them was different from the silence in the wagon. That silence had been the distance between two strangers. This one was the distance between two people who had run out of pretense. She picked up the key. The iron was cold and heavier than it looked. She held it in her palm and looked at it. "I want to see the house," she said. "I'll take you up this afternoon. I want to go now." He got his coat. The house was larger up close than it had appeared in the moonlight. The limestone blocks were hand-cut, their faces rough, their courses straight. The porch ran 40 feet across the front, its boards solid underfoot, its roof supported by squared cedar posts. She didn't speak. She walked and she looked. Inside, the floors were wide pine boards, worn smooth. A stone fireplace in the main room, big enough to stand in, with a carved mantelpiece that someone had put real work into, scrollwork along the edges, and a simple acanthus leaf repeated at the corners. The kitchen was a separate room off the back, with a cast iron range that was larger and more current than the one in the bunkhouse. its nickel trim still holding a shine. There were curtains in the windows, calico faded but hemmed straight. There was a library, a small room south-facing with 2 walls of bookshelves and a reading chair positioned to catch the window light. The shelves were half empty. The books that were there were arranged with the precision of someone who valued them specifically. Survey reports, cattlemen's journals, a complete set of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, which she had not expected, and a row of novels she could not see the spines of clearly in the low light. There was dust. Not the dust of neglect, but the dust of a place sealed against the winter, waiting. She stood in the center of the main room and put her hands in her coat pockets and looked up at the ceiling beams, cedar, straight, 12 inches across. "How long has it been empty?" she said. 14 months, he said from the doorway. "You've been in the bunkhouse for 14 months. It's a decent bunkhouse." She turned to look at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands and his shoulders at the angle of a man prepared to receive a verdict. "It smells like cedar and beeswax," she said, meaning the house. "I came up and opened it in September. Aired it out. You were expecting to bring someone here." "I was hoping," he said, which was a different word, and she heard the difference. The kitchen garden was bare but marked, its borders edged with flat limestone. She could see the structure of it, what it had been and what it could be. Tomatoes against the south wall, squash along the east border, herbs near the kitchen door where they'd be easy to reach. She walked the perimeter of it, in the thin November light, her boots crunching on the frozen grass. "The rosemary in the bunkhouse," she said. "I brought it down from here, forgot to bring it back." She stopped walking. Something complicated moved through her, not warmth exactly. Not the thing that the word affection describes, something more structural than that. The recognition of a person who had been living very carefully around the edges of the thing they wanted, who had arranged everything they owned for someone they hadn't met yet, who had brought a sprig of rosemary down the hill because they forgot. It was something you'd want to put back. She didn't say any of that. "I'll need seeds in the spring," she said, "for the garden. I know what was here, I can see the layout, but I'll need new seeds." A silence. "I'll get them," Holt said. "And the curtains in the bedroom need washing. They've been closed up too long." "All right. And there's a loose board on the second porch step. I felt it when we came in. I'll fix it this afternoon." She turned around. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was not relief exactly. It was something quieter and more tentative than relief. It was the expression of a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time and was not yet entirely certain it was safe to stop. "I'm not forgiving you," she said clearly. "Not yet. What you did with the bunkhouse was wrong. You don't test a person's worth by making them suffer." "I'm not livestock." "No," he said. "You're not. But I'm also not going back to Arroyo Falls and leaving a house with a working windmill and a south-facing library." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the precursor to one, the involuntary beginning of it before a man who had forgotten how to smile has time to stop himself. "There's a loose shutter on the east bedroom window," he said. "Bangs in the wind." "Add it to the list," she said, and started back toward the house. He fell into step beside her. Not close, not touching, but beside her, moving at the same pace over the frozen grass, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. She still had the key in her coat pocket. She could feel its weight against her hip. She left it there. Of that evening, for the first time, the main house had a fire in its front room fireplace. Holt had split fresh cedar in the yard while Nettie had found a broom and worked through 3 rooms, the dust rising in the late light and then settling again, slower than before. The calico curtains came down. She soaked them in the kitchen basin and hung them on the porch rail to dry overnight, and the windows without them looked enormous, full of darkening sky. She cooked on the big range using the herbs from the bunkhouse rack, which Holt brought up in his coat pocket without being asked. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and wood smoke, and the particular warm smell of a house that is being lived in again after a long time without it. They ate at the long pine table in the dining room, which was cold and echoey, at first their voices small in it, but the fire worked its way through the stone walls as the evening went on, and by the time she poured the coffee the room was close and warm, and the candlelight, 2 tallow candles she'd found in the pantry drawer made everything amber. He didn't say much. He didn't say much by nature, and she was starting to understand that his silence was not hostility. It was the reserve of a man who had been a long time alone and had learned to take up as little room as possible. But he refilled her coffee without being asked. And when she said, looking at the bookshelves she hadn't had a chance to look at properly in the library, that she hadn't read anything since her father got sick because there hadn't been time, he went to the shelf and came back with a book and set it beside her plate without flourish. A worn copy of something she didn't recognize the title of in the low light. She picked it up. North American Wildflowers, illustrated with engravings, some of them hand-colored, the colors faded to pastel by age. In spring, he said, there's a meadow above the east ridge. When it comes in, it'll... He stopped himself. What? She said. He looked at the table. It's something to see, he said. That's all. She set the book down beside her coffee cup. She thought about the woman who had left in May with the flour sack of silver coin and the good horse. She thought about what it meant to have had this, all of this, the house and the windmill and the spring water and the herb rack, and to have looked at it and seen only what it was worth to take. She thought about what it meant to stay. I'll want to be there, she said. When the meadow comes in, you'll take me up. Holt looked at her. In the candlelight his face was less severe, or perhaps she was just learning its arrangements. The way his expressions were small and deliberate, nothing wasted. Yes, he said, I will. Outside the November wind found the loose shutter on the east bedroom window and knocked it once, twice, announcing itself. Nettie picked up the wildflower book. The fire burned.